you feel is the most impactful technology trend in the localization industry today?
Where do I start with that? I've been spending most of my time for the past 3 years working on a cloud-based translation platform, so I'm probably a bit biased by that. But I think probably the most important trend over the next 3 to 5 years is that I would say almost all the translation-related services and workflow and systems that support that will migrate to a cloud-based environment. So even though that's not the cloud itself, that trend doesn't really have anything to do with localization per se. I think that's going to be driving a lot of design decisions and technology decisions over the next 3 to 5 years. So.
I would agree entirely with that point, but I would just add one extra thing, and that is the integration of MT with traditional translation memory, so that you have a hybrid that will provide the required level of translation. So it's just a question of integrating the two together so that where there is a translation memory match, that's fine, and if there's not, then you can get an MT match, which can then be post-edited. And depending on the required quality of the final document or the target document, you can determine how much post-editing needs to be done.
I would also add to what my colleagues have said, that there will be more integration downward in the linguistic aspects, but also upwards into the web content management and content management systems. Such integrations has been so far reserved for a select few large companies that do such integrations, but we're seeing a trend of the mid-market companies wanting to have such automation as well. And this has a big impact not only on the technology, but how services are delivered as well.
We all, I guess, have our biases based on what we do from day to day. I work on global site for Relocalize. And so sort of predictably, I want to talk briefly about open source and the role of it in localization. There's sort of a misperception that open source is an army of magical elves, based on the fact that people out there somewhere in the world make our web browsers and other things that we use. In a small industry like localization, that's not really the case, but what it's really good for is that it's a way to distribute engineering investment. And I think there's a growing realization that not necessarily for everything, but for some things, there is a real need to share certain pieces of code just so we're not constantly reinventing them. I've long thought, for instance, that there are certain barriers to innovation in localization because some of the very basic technologies you have to do, things like extracting text from a Word document or something like that, are constantly being rewritten by every company who tries to make a localization tool. And this is an enormous collective waste of effort. And the sooner we can sort of set aside some of that, break down those walls in terms of the very fundamental building blocks of localization technology, once we have that in place, we'll be able to see a much more rapid pace of innovation. And I think we're starting to get there.
And I'm wondering, what's your take on what would make companies like tool developers, what would be the driver to conform them, just to have them conform to these standards? Because you could have a standard, all the standards you want in the world, and people just wouldn't follow them. So what do you think would be the basic driver for them to do that? I have one example, for example, with going from one translation memory to another. You can have it within the same tool. You can configure a filter one way and then configure a filter the other way, and boom, you can't leverage anymore. So it's even the same tool wouldn't allow you to capture what you've done before. And we don't have, I think, a standard for that. So we can develop all the standards. What would make the tool makers follow these?
I think realistically the drivers will always have to be economic. You basically have to look at it in terms of when will there be a financial incentive, not necessarily on the tool makers, but it may be on the people who are purchasing the tools to then push that incentive upstream. Relocalize is very interested in interoperability right now, and for us, it is a financial issue. We have a multi-step tool. You know, a supply chain content comes to Relocalize, it moves around within the company, it may move to other vendors, and at every one of those hops, there's data loss, oftentimes. And, you know, and that's the reality right now. And so, you know, data loss is revenue loss for Relocalize, and so that is a financial driver for interoperability on our viewpoint. For other types of tools, for other types of tool users, there may be different answers to that, but I think it's always going to have to come back to when is the money going to talk.
And beyond the economics drives everything. But beyond the economics also, the standards needs to be more clear because as was said earlier, there is a framework of the standards, but each tool has their own specificities. And this is why we're in business, because each tool will try to work on their specificities. And right now, the standards don't encompass all of that. This is where there's data loss, and this is where even if we have an XLIF, there's so many adjustments to the XLIF that needs to be done by each of the tools that it's becoming difficult to interoperate. So initiatives like XLIF 2.0, which I hope will achieve something rapidly, should be a good step in the right direction towards that. But there's a panoply of other standards, as we've seen, that we need to do the same thing with.
It's very hard. And we can't just, even if we all say we want interoperability, it's going to take a lot more than that. I think one of the things, in addition to working on the standards, of course, it's just going to take real commitment, and it's going to take, maybe to start, it's going to take maybe, you know, 2 companies saying, we're going to make this interoperability based on standards, and we're going to, you know, commit to working together to make it work. It's not just going to be, oh, we're all going to write to XLIF and hope it all works together, because it never works out that way. It requires, you know, engineer to engineer sort of level between different companies to actually test that it's working. And maybe once we get a few of those proofed out, everyone will realize that it really can work, and we'll get a few more. That's an idea.
That requires collaboration among competitors, and that's my question. You know, right now, companies are basically locking me down with their tool. You know, I have to use their tool, otherwise I switch to another tool, I lose leveraging. So, you know, what would change that?
It might come down to finding the right 2 companies or vendors who are willing to work together to show that it can be done, and maybe that'll make others follow. And I know Relocalize, you know, not to promote, but it is definitely very interested because, you know, we're an open source provider, and we have certain things that we have and certain things that we need to interoperate to do.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can do is, if the investment required to get something in the field is low enough, then companies have an incentive to experiment. And I can cite a really good example from the marketplace right now. There's a company in Japan called MyGingo that offers essentially what looks like machine translation, but it's really being done by people. So it's sort of like Amazon's Mechanical Turk service. And they have, you know, a fairly simple API. It's easy to build around, and they, you know, provide libraries that make it easy for paying customers to get up and running with them. And so, you know, with a fairly minimal investment, they created a sales channel for their products. So I think a lot of LSPs, you know, would do well to, you know, mimic what they're doing, essentially. So even if you don't have an official standard, if there's a de facto standard that everybody's following because they want to grab some of those customers, things can happen pretty quickly.
I think the only thing I can add to the comments that have been made so far is that the drive for standardization or use of standards has to come from the users. The users have to put pressure on the tool manufacturers. And again, that comes down to economics, because if you at the end of the day say, well, I'm only going to buy a tool that is standards-based, then very quickly all the tool manufacturers will become standards-based.